So I'm a total word nerd, which probably comes as no surprise. And when Mark invited me to consider this talk about empathy, the first thing I did was consult my dictionary. And the definition of empathy that I like the best is this one: the power of imaginatively entering into another person's feelings. So I think it's an important distinction to make, that empathy is feeling with somebody, and compassion or sympathy is when you feel for somebody. And why do we care about empathy at all? Well, quite simply, empathy can make the world a kinder and better place. So when we're able to step into another person's shoes and recognize that person's suffering, what happens when we're really able to do that is that it becomes almost impossible not to act. We're suddenly woken up to this almost urgent need to do something. And I think it's important also to know that empathy is scalable. Today I don't want to just talk about empathy on like a global scale, although we'll talk about that, but how empathy can make our lives a better place on the micro or more micro level as well. So yes, it can make the world a better place, but more empathy also makes our workplaces a better place. It makes our marriages a better place as well. So we know this, I think we all know this, and yet Barack Obama famously described our society as having this sort of epidemic, this empathy deficit. And why is that? And as I've been reflecting on this, I think there's something kind of obvious, but I think it's worth noting, and that's that you have to be invited into someone's feelings. So empathy is, in some ways, by invitation only. You can't sort of break and enter into someone's feelings. You can't bust their emotional door down. Someone has to open it for you. And that's really what I want to focus on today, because I think that there's something blocked kind of further up the empathy stream. So here's how I see empathy. Here's what I think needs to happen to get to empathy. First, we need to be authentic. We need to be able to own what it is to be our most true self. And from there, I think we can find the courage to be vulnerable. And from there begets emotional connection between people. And that is when there is an environment present for someone to feel empathy. And from there we get a kinder and better place. And what I want to talk about today is that authenticity piece. It's where I think a lot of people are blocked way up that empathy stream. And I, more than anyone, should be really good at this because I preach it to our clients all the time. As the head of a storytelling agency at Echo, we're always telling our clients, you have to, if you want people to read your stories, you have to tell an authentic, full picture of your story. You have to weave in the emotional texture. Otherwise, it just doesn't read as believable, and it's not that interesting. But it's hard. It's hard for them. It's hard for people to open up and reveal emotion. It's hard for our clients, and it's actually really hard for me too. The truth is that I'm up here, and And I really want you guys to like me. Like, that's what I really want. I want you to be like live tweeting, like, she's great and she's clever and she's charming and she's charismatic, and that's like a big part of what's going on for me in preparing for this talk, and that's my honest experience. I don't think that's everyone's honest experience. I think some people are actually really good at authenticity. I'm not that good at it. So I'm curious, I think I know the answer to this, but how many of you, by show of hands, have seen Brene Brown's talk on vulnerability? Yeah, okay, so not surprising. I think 20 million people have seen it. And if you haven't seen it, it's really worth watching. It's her TED Talk, and she's got some great books. And I'm a huge fan. And I mean, no disrespect, because I really am. She's been a big influence on me. But I do take some issue with the word vulnerability. And the reason is that in the context of my work at Echo, vulnerability, and bear in mind that the profile of our clients are typically the CEOs of fairly large companies, and then those large companies themselves. And the word vulnerability is super alarming to them. So they hear the word vulnerability, and they think vulnerable to military coup. They think vulnerable to their servers being hacked. They think about their own bodies being vulnerable to cancer or like awful diseases. And it really doesn't serve my purpose, which is to like encourage them to open up by using this word vulnerable, because they sort of like double back on the defense. So I'm a bigger fan of the word authenticity. And to be fair, like I described earlier, I think it is kind of a precursor in some ways to vulnerability. Or, I mean, maybe another way of looking at it is that it's kind of the bigger container. It's our true self. It's our genuine self. And within that authenticity, there is vulnerability, of course. And there's also shame, which Brene Brown talks about. But there's also confidence and ambition, and there's grief and joy, and there's everything, right? There's our full, complex, and evolving experience of being human and being our own unique selves. I just personally find authenticity, it may be a tip for those of you that are working with your own clients and encouraging them to go a little deeper, that I found some success in working with kind of alpha type A's that respond a little better to authenticity. So here's the thing, that despite intellectually understanding the value of authenticity, it remains really hard for me, and I know that it remains hard for a lot of people. I think it's really uncomfortable for most brands to be authentic, and there are some brands that do it really well, and I'm going to talk about that later. But if Barack Obama's right, and there's something that is this sort of empathy deficit, then I guess you could say that in some ways I have this sort of authenticity deficit. And I can trace this challenge of mine with being authentic back to grade 5. So this is me. Not a high point in my life. This is me in grade 5. I had just, I played backcatcher without a mask, broke my nose, and also got netgear. Super cool. And at the same time, I experienced what I'm guessing many of you experienced, and probably more of the women maybe in the room than the guys. But I experienced this sort of social torture that happens to so many girls at this age, and I call it all your friends suddenly decide to hate you. And it's almost universal in a way that makes me wonder if it has some kind of evolutionary value. But that said, I remember, and 10 is, they say like 10 is a super formative age. Like if you want to not screw your kids up, just like be really good to them when they're 10. But I remember, well, I first of all really remember how it felt. I actually remember fantasizing about dying and how all these girls would go to my funeral and they feel so bad. And then I also remember how I dealt with it. And this is the really disturbing part, is I remember deciding that what I had to do was I had to just pay attention to what they didn't like about me, and then I would just change that side of me and see what happened. And it was this kind of Machiavellian experiment, listening, like, you know, and I can remember like on the side of my desk, writing in my journal, like totally for their benefit, like hoping they would see it, like just weird stuff. And the weird and surprising and kind of magical thing in a way is that it worked. And I remember these girls being like, oh my God, you know, you used to be so annoying and like so boring, but now you're super cool and like you can be our friend again. and I was like, oh my God, that's great. Like I'll totally be your friend again. And it totally internalized for me as this like, oh my gosh, the best magic trick ever. Like all you do is you just like assess what people want from you and you just be that and then they'll like you and you'll always be happy. So another kind of disturbing story is that recently my son, who actually turns 5 today, he graduated from his preschool a couple months ago. And they do something for all the kids at his preschool when they're graduating, they make this little book, and it's a super cute book with like photographs from him from over the years, and the kids draw pictures, and then they ask the kids a couple of sort of fun questions. So, you know, what's your favorite food? What's your least favorite food? Favorite color? Favorite pet? And what do you want to be when you grow up? So my son, Booker, in his little book, he comes home and he shows it to me. Now, the boys in his preschool are all obsessed with fire trucks, but not my son. Like, he truly doesn't care about fire trucks. But what he answered on his question, the teachers asked, and they wrote down what he said he wanted to be a fire truck driver. And this floored me, because I happen to know that my son wants to be a nun. I'm not kidding. He is totally obsessed with the sound of music. And when I ask him why he wants to be a nun, he says, like, obviously they sing all the time and they get to hang out with their friends. Like, well, why wouldn't I want to be a nun? So I haven't had the heart to tell him, like, there's some pragmatic reasons, several why he can't be a nun. But the point is that this tender age of 4, he had somehow sensed that he would face sort of ridicule for answering authentically that he like really wants to be a nun when he grows up, and that he would in fact affect some kind of social acceptance if he answered like fraudulently that he wanted to be a fire truck driver. And this totally broke my heart. So as for me, you know, after grade 5, I relied heavily on this magic trick of like, okay, I walk into a room, I determine what they want from me, I deliver that, they like me, all is well. And it kind of works. You know, I've gone on, I've made friends, I've had some semblance of success, and along the way, I have avoided offending people, and I've avoided sort of that social trauma of all your friends suddenly hate you. That hasn't happened again. So I guess my question is, you know, is it so bad? Is it so bad to present a kind of watered down version of ourselves that fits what people need, and not risk the possibility of getting hurt? What I've realized, at least intellectually, because old habits die hard, is that we can impress people from a distance, but you can only connect with people up close. And if we want meaningful, intimate relationships, then we have to reveal some emotion. We have to reveal some of our true self. And the reason is that if we don't, we're not known. And so the person that they're connecting with isn't me anyways. And what does it mean when we're sort of epidemically or endemically not known? And that's called loneliness. So in Vancouver, interestingly, we're officially a hotbed of loneliness. The Vancouver Foundation did a study a couple of years ago, and respondents named social isolation and specifically loneliness as their most pressing concern. And loneliness, and I think this is really important to emphasize because this wasn't the way we perceived and talked about loneliness even 10 years ago. But loneliness is not the same as being alone. Loneliness is measured by the quality of relationships, not the quantity of our relationships. So the loneliness epidemic in our society, it isn't about people on their own necessarily. It's about people who, quite likely have lots of colleagues and maybe even a big social network, but they don't feel known. So they don't feel like they're deeply and emotionally connecting to the people around them. And, I think in many ways social media has made this worse, ironically. You've probably heard of the phenomenon called fakebooking. So this is the phenomena of people curating these perfect lives online, when in fact, her house is probably a total mess and her kid's having a legendary tantrum and her marriage has been on the rocks for months. But no, on Facebook, it paints this perfect picture. And it's so sad because Facebook has, and I do think still, had and has the potential to socially connect us, but in many ways, what it's become is a catalyst for social isolation. And then to make matters even more dire, my talk gets happier later, I promise. But to make matters even more dire, loneliness isn't just a social and emotional problem, but it's a public health crisis. So now, if you suffer from chronic loneliness, you're at risk for heart disease, anxiety, the list goes on. The medical health community actually officially recognizes loneliness as being as bad for you as smoking or being morbidly obese in terms of reduced life expectancy. So, what's the antidote for this? What's the cure? It goes back to emotional connection. So it's being yourself and revealing your authentic self, allowing people in. And I do work hard at this. And like I said, old habits die hard. But when I said I was crap at it, it's not for lack of trying. I do work at it. And sometimes when I need some encouragement, I remember a story that I was told about 20 years ago when I was in journalism school. And I had the privilege of interviewing a guy, an older guy who had been a professional athlete, and he was a pretty powerful, both physically and in the community, pretty powerful guy. So there I was interviewing when I was young and a bit nervous, and he was also a really positive force, really positive presence. So I remember asking him, "What accounts for you being so positive?" And he didn't miss a beat. He said, "Oh, that goes back to my daughter's graduation." So he then tells me that his daughter has cerebral palsy. And he tells me about this day. He's in the auditorium, and he's just sweating bullets. And he's so anxious about the moment when her name is going to be called, and she's going to have to make her way across the stage slowly, on crutches to get her diploma. So he's sitting there and he's anxious, and eventually, of course, her name does get called, and it's just as bad as he feared, in the sense that she makes her way across the stage, and it's painfully slow, and the auditorium's really quiet, and she's making her way, across the stage, and she gets to the other side of the stage, and the principal hands her her diploma, and she turns, and she faces the audience, and she lifts her diploma up in the air. And at first, her dad didn't really know what was happening because the clapping started kind of slowly. And then a few people stood up, and then the clapping got louder. And then more people stood up, and then all of a sudden everyone was standing up, and everyone was clapping and chanting her name. And the only person who wasn't standing up was him. He was sitting in his seat just weeping, just crying. And he was crying out of shame for not seeing her for this amazing woman, young woman that she was, and crying out of pride, and crying out of a commitment to spend the rest of his life earning back the privilege to be a father to this most amazing, courageous young woman. And I'm so grateful for him having shared that story with me for so many obvious reasons. I mean, it's such a powerful story. But for me, at that point in my life, it was an epiphany. It was, here is this powerful man sharing with me this moment of like deep shame, like his probably most raw, vulnerable moment. And what I noticed was that I wasn't judging him for it, because that's always what I would worry about being authentic, is that someone would judge me. But of course, I wasn't judging him. I felt so connected to him in that moment. So I do frequently think about that and just try to remember that my fear of being judged, and I think when those of us that experience maybe the same authenticity challenge that I do, that's us projecting the belief that we're going to be judged so much more than any kind of objective reality that's going to happen. So I've established, I think, that empathy can change the world, right? It can make the world a better place. And to do that, we need to unblock this authenticity piece. And from there, we get emotional connection and the courage to be vulnerable. And that, in fact, hopefully I've established that it's really wise to get authentic, because otherwise, basically, you just die early. You have a heart attack. So this is motivating. So how do we do it? What is the best way to achieve emotional connection? And the best way is through story. And this isn't just my bias, running Echo, the storytelling agency. It is, in fact, science that tells us that the most effective way to emotionally connect is through story. So before we get into that, what is a story and what is a story not? So first of all, a story isn't, it was good, it got better, the end. So I guarantee none of you have ever read a novel or seen a movie with that plot. That is not a story. A story, at its most basic foundation, is you take a person from point A to point B, and there's some kind of obstacle or challenge in between. So why is this most basic, formula so effective? Well, it goes back to evolution, actually. We're understandably hardwired to learn from other people's mistakes. So we hear a story about, Jimmy pet a tiger, Jimmy got eaten by the tiger, mental note, don't pet tigers. So it's a super handy brain trick that we log these very permanently when somebody shares a story about like a big gaffe. What neurologists can now prove, and of course like priests and shamans have known this for hundreds of years, but what we can now prove by plugging electrodes onto two people's brains is that when I tell you a story, the MRI shows like certain parts of my brain lighting up, and when you hear my story, and you've got electrodes attached to your brain, the MRI shows all the parts of your brain lighting up in the same parts that lit up in my brain. Does that make sense? So this is a really cool brain trick called mirror neurons. And of course, we've all experienced this when we've watched horror movies, right? Because we totally know it's just a movie, but we're like screaming at the like pretty girl who's about to get like hatcheted up. Like, don't go in there. And we're feeling all of this panic, and we're basically feeling all of the same emotions that we're seeing on screen. So this is the phenomenon of mirror neurons. So you're reflecting the same experience that I felt that I'm retelling to you in the form of story. another way of thinking about it is almost like I'm colonizing your brain with my story. And if we go back to the definition of empathy, being able to transport into someone's feelings, this really is so effectively done, most effectively done through story. I sometimes think of story as empathy's most effective mode of transportation. So here's the thing. Despite all this, authenticity doesn't come that naturally to me. One thing I will share with you that's helped me is making a commitment to premeditated authenticity. So before I go into an event, I actually psych myself up. If I just allow myself to go in organically, my old brain kicks in, and it's so loud at determining and trying to read the room and what do they want from me and how will they make them like me. But if I kind of get grounded and I go in, I have a slightly better chance of just getting in touch with my authentic self and delivering that into a situation and giving myself the opportunity to emotionally connect and chip away at the risk of dying young and alone or lonely. So that said, I'm also a pragmatist, and I'm not preaching that we all become vulnerability evangelists. That's not what that's hopefully not what you take away from this talk. I don't think it's appropriate to download our fears and failures on everyone we meet, and I think sometimes, you can almost see the person that's just seen Brene Brown's talk because you're whoa, they're really practicing vulnerability in a big way, and that's okay, but it's not always appropriate or wise to be a victim of your own kind of runaway authenticity. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a retreat. I have, in this sort of quest to become more authentic. I've gone to these retreats where it's really meant to be a safe space for vulnerability. And sometimes these can edge almost towards what I call sort of the vulnerability Olympics, where somebody shares something personal, and you're like, oh my God, that was so brave. You're like, I should really ante up something really deep. And so you go and you deliver something that you think is really deep, and then the next person is like, oh my God, that was so, I had so much good shame. They really got to the root of their shame. And you're like, what do I have? Oh my God, I've got great shame. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. They ante it, and it's this weird one-upping of shame, and it's this weird sort of authenticity competition. And that's also not the point. It actually might be what some people need to really bust out in that moment, but it's probably not sustainable, over the long term. Not if you want friends. So really, what I'm saying is that I, at least, just want choice. I just want to be able to choose in any given circumstance how much of my authentic self I share. And there might be occasions where I want to be totally transparent, and there might be some occasions where I want to deliver little gems of my authentic self, but I want to be that agent of my own authenticity. And that's what I find so frustrating, is that I'm often not. I often find that, again, that sort of old habit rears up, and my brain is much more conscious of wanting to be liked rather than wanting to be authentic. So with brands, I also don't recommend runaway, radical vulnerability. I don't think we need the same level of intimacy with our brands, that we do with our husbands or wives. And that's okay. Our tacit agreement with our brands, our favorite brands, is that they're there to win and retain our business. So that's okay, that's our agreement with them. That said, we do want some emotional connection with our favorite brands. Really, that's how we bond with them, that's how they earn our trust. And if we don't get that kind of emotional connection with them, then they don't have our loyalty. And we're quite happy to spend our consumer dollars, with their competitor if it's more convenient or it's cheaper or it's faster. We have no real loyalty to those brands. So some brands do authenticity and transparency and even vulnerability really well. Patagonia is probably the gold standard of this. They have a really interesting initiative called the Footprint Chronicles, where they are super transparent about their supply chain, and they also really own up where it's not perfect. McDonald's reacted, but I think in an interesting way, to the film Super Size Me. And at the same time, a couple of really obese young women sued McDonald's, ultimately unsuccessfully, for saying that they were creating addictive food that was marketing to children, basically. And it was just as criminal as marketing cigarettes to children. So anyways, McDonald's, this was a couple of years ago, they responded with an Our Food, Your Questions campaign, and they received more than 20,000 questions about their food, and they committed to answer those questions 100% honestly, and within a year, their brand trust went up by 60%. Chipotle, interestingly, has kind of responded to some of the departure away from McDonald's to a generation that wants food without GMOs, and Chipotle's done a great job of being very values and purpose first about food with integrity, which is what they stand for. But their tortillas have a whole bunch of chemical names in them that you can't pronounce, and they're also really upfront about this and just saying, we haven't perfected the tortilla. That is one area that we want it moist, we don't want it to get moldy, and so we've had to put these weird things that are unpronounceable in it, but we're working on it. And Starbucks and Levi's are interesting because they're two examples of fairly recent periods in the brand's history where the CEOs have stepped up and I think been impressively blunt and honest. When Howard Schultz took over Starbucks again at the helm, he was really candid about saying, we've totally lost our way. We've made a ton of really bad decisions. We've grown too fast. We've focused on the wrong things. He shut all of the stores down for 3.5 hours globally, and he flew 11,000 managers in and sort of in an attempt to retrain them and say, we lost our way, we need to find our way again. And Levi's, most recently, just the CEO said basically, we so didn't see the yoga pants thing coming. We saw yoga pants, but we just didn't really see yoga pants coming. Not as the threat that it is, which was to virtually decimate the Levi's brand. And he basically, he came out and said, the stuff we have on the shelves is not what our customers want. So with these last two examples, I do think it's worth mentioning that as a leader, for those of you that are in the room that lead organizations, your employees want the same emotional connection and transparency as your customers do. So we're not just out there to attract and retain customers. Of course, we're out there to attract and retain employees as well. And they want and deserve that same authenticity and vulnerability and emotional connection that customers want. How am I doing for time?
We're out of it.
Okay. Then I will move along.
Take your time, it's fine.
Yeah, I was going to share. If there's time in the question period, I will. So I was going to share a lesson I learned at Echo of being a really bad leader, but we'll just skip through that. Okay, you can quiz me on it later. But I did want to end with this. So I'm sure a lot of you saw this photo in social media or on the news yesterday, and I might cry because I just wept yesterday. So if you haven't heard about what happened, a beautiful little boy, little Syrian boy named Aylin, he and his 5-year-old brother and his mother and his father climbed aboard a little boat with 8 other Syrian refugees from Turkey, and they set off for Greece, and they didn't make it. The seas got rough, and the smugglers jumped overboard, and the boat capsized, and Aylin's mom couldn't swim, and so she drowned right away. And Abdullah, Aylin's dad, if you haven't heard the interview with Abdullah's sister, she lives in Lower Mainland, and she talked about this yesterday, and she translated his story, which was that he was holding Galip in one arm and Aylin in the other arm, and he was yelling at them not to die. And then he realized that Galip was already dead, so he let him go. And he focused on saving Aylin. And when he looked at him, there was already blood coming out of his eyes. And so he let him go as well. And he, I guess, swam back to the Turkish beach. I mean, what do you do with that? I just remember driving. I remember driving yesterday. I went to pick my son up, and I had to sort of compose myself. Sorry. Before picking him up, I was just ravaged, as I should be, right? As we all should be, by the story. And then, what I noticed, I guess, was that my anguish, and this doesn't always happen, but my anguish did turn to outrage, and that is empathy, right? That is when we suddenly are like, fuck, I have to do something. I can't just feel for this person. I am actually, my heart has run away, and I'm not in control of this anymore, and I am feeling grief with this person and this family, and I need to do something. And that is not an easy place to stand in, and it was a real awareness for me that empathy is not easy. But in fact, as Roger Ebert said, it's the most essential quality of our civilization. So I guess I just want to end by saying it's worth it. Empathy is worth it. And that in our own small way, at least in my small way, I plan to continue to try, and I urge you to try, to just start by being brave enough to be yourself. So thank you.
You mentioned you didn't get to tell a story about bad leadership that related to empathy. Can you start by telling us that, and then we'll go into the questions?
Sure. Sure. I've got some of my crew from Echo here, so they can, some of them at least that were there can probably remember this moment. So essentially, I had had my daughter, my second child, and I was spending quite a bit of time at home, and at the same time I was thinking really deeply about the future of Echo. So for years, since 1999, we've been a custom book publisher, and we've been doing biographies for individuals and company history books, and I was starting to see the writing on the wall, that maybe books, shouldn't be our only medium, that we should, evolve into more of a storytelling agency and be more medium agnostic. So I was thinking really deeply about this, but the problem was I was doing all of this thinking on my own, with a baby at home, which is perhaps also not advisable for clear thought. So what I decided to do, and of course this is me thinking about my team and what I think they want from me, instead of just thinking to ask them, but instead thinking that what they want from me and need from me is for me to deliver this Steve Jobs galvanizing, rousing talk. The awkward thing was that there's 8 of them, but I stood up and I prepared this. I think I did it for 2 hours, and I for some reason kept saying we're all gonna die. That was a big theme, and I was so don't we just want to give it our all, because we're all just gonna die anyways, and just flat blank. But I wasn't even seeing the blank. I just talked and talked, because I really felt that they needed this visionary moment of my leadership. And I expected, actually at the end, that they would just stand up, and like all 8 of them would like stand up and just like this rousing, like standing ovation. And instead what happened was like total radio silence in the room. And I was like, so like now's the time when you like clap and say like, that was awesome, and like we're behind you, and like we love this vision. And but finally one of my colleagues broke the silence and was like, so like, do we still have jobs? Like, what? And so my point being, that as leaders, it is also important for us to recognize, like maybe 50 years ago, it was cool for a leader to be this sort of impervious emblem of like, always strength. And for sure, I think people still deserve and want a leader who's strong and has vision, but only if that is their authentic experience. If the genuine moment, which it was for me, is that like I had tons of questions. Like I wasn't sure if this was the right decision. Would we alienate all our individual family clients by going this more corporate direction? And I had all these questions, and it would have been so much more generous and genuine and authentic and connective if I had brought those questions and engaged my team instead of like doing a weird Steve Jobs impersonation.
I suspect I'm not the only one in the room that can relate to this story. Inside joke. Yes?
Not a question, just a statement. Our group liked you.
I don't need any more. I'm good.
Hi. We had an interesting discussion in that few minutes, and I don't know if this is a question, and it's not to put you on the spot, but the diagram that you shared at the beginning, where you go from authenticity and vulnerability all the way through to empathy, it occurred to us that maybe one of the blocks to getting to empathy from a place of sympathy is actually action that's required when you have an empathetic kind of perspective. So I don't know, maybe you could just comment on that.
So is your question, your question is the sort of sympathy path versus the empathy path is that moment where we're inspired to act?
Well, in order to be empathetic, you might need to actually think about what that means in terms of action.
Mm-hmm.
You're almost becoming an agent for that person.
Yeah, and I think my understanding and my experience of it, at least, is that we don't even think it. Like, it's not a conscious choice. It's like this. It's like we're sort of it's like, my experience yesterday, we're just sort of overtaken by, as though it is happening to us. Like, we want to act in the same way that we would if this was happening to us. It's that sort of level of merging. It's that like colonizing of feeling, like the MRIs show, that like really we're almost experiencing the suffering, and that is that moment of empathy. And so I suppose the sort of upstream block that I talk about is in some ways it might be more on the personal divulging of information versus a girlfriend of mine recently diagnosed with breast cancer. Like, she's not sort of choosing to share some secret. Like, this is happening to her, and like the empathy it evokes is immediate, in all of her friends, and she didn't have to get in touch with like her authentic conundrum in order to share that. So I think that block sometimes happens more around the things we choose to share or not to share, and maybe those little moments. I'm a big fan of kind of our lives being so often a sum of all of these little moments that I think we can sometimes dismiss, but are in fact like hugely shaping of who we are. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Hi, my name is Perry Goldson. We had a kind of a question. We were talking about empathy. We always take empathy from a negative point of view. What about, we wonder if you had a comment about the positive side. Is there such thing?
Right, of course, because I talked about and framed it as putting yourself in the shoes of someone who's suffering, right? We do tend to think of it that way. I do tend to think of it that way. And of course, yes, I would say there is a framing of it as the positive, that sort of full spectrum of our experience, being, not just shame and vulnerability, and but also joy and And in fact, I used to belong, I don't anymore now that I've got kids, my time is more at a premium, but I used to belong to these forums for entrepreneurs. And one of the main reasons these forums exist is that there's sort of this axiom that it's lonely at the top, or that only other entrepreneurs can appreciate some of the struggles, but also the triumphs that you experience, as an entrepreneur, and that it might feel like weirdly boastful to share that with somebody else, but that you can like, wow, yeah, like this happened to me, this is awesome, and like your other entrepreneurs around the table empathically will like, feel that as you tell that story and cheer you on. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think absolutely, yeah, absolutely, it can be in a positive context.
Thank you for sharing the senior boy story. My question is, when I see hockey players playing hockey and then they fall on the ground after being hit on the neck and probably lose their future career in hockey. I was wondering when people cheer fightings between players on hockey field, are they showing sympathy or empathy, or because it seems that we cheer violence, whether it's against sport or hockey, or. And my second question, you mentioned you had a child. Is there an empathetic relationship between your children and your grandparents? Thank you.
Well, great question. It's a big and important question. My husband actually makes documentary films about sports, so he should be answering your first question. I tend to think that it comes from some probably human desire to belong to a tribe, and that our cheering for the violence isn't perhaps so much exactly that we're cheering for violence as much as we're cheering for our team, our tribe, winning over another tribe, and that we're connected and victorious in some way. We have a long history of being violent and aligning, tribe against tribe. So, where does empathy fit into that? The point of really, we have a client who's a big philanthropist, and he's really candid with his kids, who are often asking, because he does a lot of good work, and they're always like, Dad, why is there so much strife in the world? And he's really candid, and he says, like, that's not going away. Like, people like power, and that is just true, and we just try to make the difference where we can. So it's probably a bit simplistic for me to say empathy is going to make the world, a kind and happy place. I think it can make the world a kinder and happier place. And of course, if I could like wave a magic wand and all this, and we all had empathy, there would be no war, right? We would truly be able to experience the suffering from another person's perspective, and so I think perhaps there would also be no fighting in hockey. To your second point, my kids have a really close relationship with their grandparents. There's an old saying, I don't know if it's a First Nation saying, that children and grandparents get along so well because they have the same common enemy. Empathy, and I won't go on too long about this, but you could pick up, and I have picked up many. I have lost the plot as a parent many times, and I've picked up many books. I have a big library of parenting books, and they all basically, I don't need to buy anymore because they kind of all come down to the same thing, which is like show empathy to your child. Like it is a little bit of a silver bullet when it comes to parenting, and I think probably my kids' grandparents do that better than I do because they don't have as much of the other kind of stuff holding all those other reins as we do as parents.
We have time for one more question. We're a little late today.
So back to your diagram, there's authenticity and then empathy. I felt that these two go rather both ways on the same level. So to oversimplify it, I guess empathy is more listening, more receiving, and authenticity is rather expressing, saying. So, sorry, I'm just a bit longer maybe to say what we discussed in our group. The question was, how do you make, what is the question? Yeah, but on a larger scale, how do you make people all around empathic? And I thought you just have to begin from yourself, is to show that you're not judging, you're accepting whatever you're about to hear. You're not about to go, just speak and speak and speak. And then the other side sees, oh, you're actually listening. So it's up and door, and this way you're spreading that. That's on the empathic side. On an authentic side, I would still say it's very good to be inauthentic, because it opens the door for your own improvement. But you still have to be accepting that. You're accepting you're not perfect.
Yeah, absolutely.
So actually you have to be very authentic only with the part that you want to listen to.
Right.
Sincerely.
Yeah.
So that's more of a question. If you agree anywhere there, does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you're right. Authenticity is outward, and empathy is the receiving. You know, to the point that you made, it is the very generous thing to go first. to you know, the next time you're in some kind of event like this, or is, you know, to maybe practice a little bit of that premeditated authenticity if it doesn't come naturally, and like plan. It sounds a bit contrived, but actually I think it's quite generous to, especially if it's awkward for you, but to practice, you know, depositing just a environment appropriate little bit of yourself, and see what happens, because quite likely the person empathic will receive it and probably volley something back to you.
Amazing. We're going to leave it there. That is such tremendous. Thank you guys for participating. Thank you for that.